And the whole time he was talking, I saw this demon in a dark cloak with a knife in its hand standing behind him. And it had this knife in its hand that was ready to just stab him, ready to just release so much darkness in his life.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Blake Healy, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Indestructible: Fight Your Spiritual Battles from the Winning Side. Blake, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here again.
Now, I know Blake is going to be new to some of you, so let me take a moment to read through his bio. Blake is one of the senior team members at Bethel Church of Atlanta. He's also the director of Bethel Atlanta School of Supernatural Ministry. And finally, Blake and his wife April make their home in Peachtree City, Georgia, where they live with their 5 children. Blake, anything I missed? Any gaps you'd want to fill in about your bio?
Oh, no, that's all the important stuff.
We've hit all the highlights, so we will keep moving forward. Let's get into what we might call the story behind the book. I'm curious now, had you always wanted to write a book on spiritual warfare, or is this something God had to nudge you to do?
He probably had to do a little bit more than nudge. I was actually really resistant to the idea, partially just because there's so many books about spiritual warfare and so many good ones, And so for the longest time, I really had no desire. I think, at least initially, I felt that some of my other books, because a lot of what I write about is my experience with regard to seeing in the spirit, always had some hints of what I had to say about spiritual warfare in them. And so I, personally at least, I felt satisfied, in just kind of addressing it lightly in other stuff. But I share a little bit more detailed version of the story in the book. But I just slowly over the years, and I hope this is something anyone who's read any of my other books has picked up is, I really, with regard to the spirit in general, but especially seeing in the spirit, I just believe that we're meant to experience all of that stuff from heaven's perspective, from God's perspective, and that the vast majority of our attention should be focused on Him and what He's doing. And so because of that, I was even a little bit tentative about how I even felt, in what way I would even feel comfortable writing a book about spiritual warfare, just because there are lots of accounts that I've found maybe focus too much on the enemy, or even in some ways can make the enemy, in my opinion, feel more powerful than he is. And so, but in the midst of that, I just have slowly felt the Lord pulling me more to address some of the issues I talk about in the book. And honestly, I've felt largely for some of the first time, I felt like He's given me ways to talk about it that feel like they don't violate some of my values around how we approach this seeing in the spirit. So basically, he very, very slowly talked me into it, if I would put it that way.
As God often does for so many of the assignments that He gives us. In terms of this book's unique contribution to the conversation, I mean, you alluded to that there's a lot of great spiritual warfare themed books. And, as somebody that works in the Christian publishing space, I can vouch for that. There are tons of spiritual warfare books coming onto the market each year. So, Blake, if you had to summarize that unique thing that this book is going to bring to the conversation or highlight, what might that be?
Yeah, so there are really kind of 2 things that I felt that I, could contribute to this conversation. And for those of you who are familiar with me, a big part of my testimony is that I've seen in the spirit since I was very young. I've, for as long as I can remember, seen angels, demons, and other spiritual things. And so one of the first things I wanted to do was to give some insight into some of the ways that over the last 30 years or so of seeing the spirit, that I've seen the enemy try to attack people, especially ways that we may not, that I wasn't necessarily seeing addressed very frequently in other works. Just some of the subtler, some of the ways you can kind of trick us into getting more stuck in things than we need to. And so I did see some value in being able to identify those things, explain what they look like, and I've often found the way that they look can kind of help us have a little bit of a trigger point if we are feeling those things happen, or we're feeling ourselves kind of being drawn into some of those thought processes, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit later. The other part too was a lot, and again, I'm hesitant to criticize anyone's approach, but a lot of the spiritual warfare books that I ran into would more often than not be reinforcing the truth, that we have victory in Jesus, and that, our victory is in him, and that God's more powerful. Jesus, the blood of Jesus covers everything. And that's great. That's awesome. And then maybe they would just have some prayers or some kind of activations of that sense. And again, those are great too. One little gap that I did see was, in my experience, something that I actually see contributing as one of the main factors that actually causes people to have a lifestyle of victory when it comes to spiritual warfare. And that's what kind of behaviors, what kind of habits, and what kinds of things that we can do in the ecosystem of our lives, the elements that we can add to our life ecosystem that create an environment that's inhospitable to the enemy and hospitable for the things of God. And so that was a big part of the focus of the book. Again, just based on what I've observed over the years, here are the things that I see people doing that actually just creates an environment where the plots and plans of the enemy just kind of naturally fall apart. And so that's a big subject that I wanted to address.
Well, when it comes to something like spiritual warfare, obviously our lens, our worldview, that's going to really set the stage for how we understand or pursue spiritual warfare, whether we're talking about other books that are on the market or maybe, Blake, just things that you've encountered as you've been a teacher and a minister for so many years. What does the average Christian maybe misunderstand about spiritual warfare, or how are they not approaching it, say, through heaven's perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the major things, and I think a lot of people I run into have at least part of this perception down, but I think I see a lot of people who have, I guess, what I would call like holes in this reality. But, the way I like to illustrate this is, one of the main ways that God in the Bible represents spiritual warfare is by calling it a battle between light and dark. And very frequently, darkness is used as a metaphor for sin, the plans of the enemy, and everything having to do with that. And light is often used as a metaphor for God, his kingdom, his purposes, and his plans. It's one fundamental thing that this metaphor illustrates so well is the reality that this is a battle between light and dark. Now, it's so important to be aware of what the magnitude of what that means, actually, because if I'm in my office and I switch on the light, there isn't a fight for the light to overcome the darkness that was in there before. In fact, darkness is nothing except the absence of light. And, even this is silly, but it's true that, when I turn on the light, the darkness doesn't slowly creep away. It doesn't slowly get scrubbed away like a stain. As soon as light is present, it's gone. And again, this reinforces the truth that the battle between God and the enemy is not a battle of equal forces. It's not even a battle of disproportional forces. It's not a battle where God has 100 soldiers and the enemy has 100 soldiers. And it's not even a battle where God has 100 soldiers and the enemy has 10. It is a fundamental victory where, again, the second that God is present, darkness is defeated. And so because of that, the battle then is not in whether the light is going to defeat the darkness. The battle is in whether we have decided to turn the lights on or not. And so to me, this really changes the way that we engage. Instead of, I'm feeling so attacked by the enemy, or I'm feeling so overwhelmed, or I'm feeling so, under it. These are kind of phrases you'll hear Christians say is, where's the light not on in my life? Because this is not what it feels like in God's light. This is not the way that I see the world when I'm standing in his light. And so it's a simple thing. It's a fundamental thing, but it's so important because it sets us up to look for the right thing.
Blake, next let's transition into some of the ground you cover in what I might call the middle part of the book. And that's where you talk about some of the tactics and traps that the enemy uses to hold us back. Talk to us about the tactic or the trap of shame. How does the enemy use that?
Yeah, so I'll use an example here, and I'll try to give an abbreviated version of the story. But this is a story I've seen, 1,000 different ways, with slightly different elements, but the exact same kind of story. There's this guy I'd known for a long time, and he had grown up with problems with drug addiction pretty much his whole life. In his kind of lower middle age of life, he started to get clean, stopped doing a lot of the heavier drugs, but he just couldn't shake his addiction to alcohol. He'd be doing fine for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even a month at a time. And then he would just, go on a big bender, have a really bad weekend, and be drinking very heavily and even scarily, where it was dangerous for him and others. And so, eventually this led to him, spending a short amount of jail time because of driving under the influence. And, he got released, and I saw him at a church, and he's looking downcast, he's looking sad. I'm asking him how he's doing, and he's saying all these things that are, that kind of negative, downtrodden, kind of beating himself up about it kind of phrases. And as I'm looking at him, there's this demon standing next to him, and every time he says one of these, self-deprecating phrases, I see it dump this bucket of this thick, tar-like oil over his head, and it's this black, thick stuff. And again, over and over, it keeps pouring this over his head. And I can just feel the shame being released on him every time he's saying these things. In fact, so much so that I actually stopped him from talking and said, please don't talk about yourself that way. I saw him a few weeks later, and the very same demon was there, and it was picking at him. It was picking at these wounds that I saw on him. And when I see wounds on people, that represents the hurts that we experience going through life, whether that's harsh words from someone or something, bigger or deeper from our past. But this demon was coming by and, picking at all these wounds, kind of pulling at them with one hand, and with the other hand, it was shaking this brown bottle in front of his face, again, pulling on his pain and tempting him to medicate that pain with alcohol. And the next time I saw him, he showed up to church drunk, and he was clearly, again, under the influence of alcohol. And as soon as he saw me see him, again, that demon, the exact same demon, pulled out this bucket of shame and just dumped it on his head again. And there's a lot to kind of pull out of there, but one thing I do like to address for some, to actually really try to incite a little bit of, I think, righteous anger, that I've seen so many people in these kinds of shame cycles of they do something that they don't want to, that doesn't feel right to them, that, isn't, linked with their value system. And they, experience this heavy, heavy shame, but that exact shame is meant to cause them so much self-hatred and pain that it actually leads them right back to that very thing that caused it. And again, it's the way the enemy works, that he doesn't really care if it's shame is what's getting you or alcohol is what's getting you. He's just throwing whatever is going to trip you up. And it's the exact same demon that is tempting him to use alcohol to numb his pain as is blaming him and saying how dumb he is and how foolish he is for doing it. And so, that's a cycle that I've seen way too many times.
Next, Blake, I'd love you to talk about distraction. I feel like that's one that's on display and kind of running rampant these days with all the things that are available to distract us. So how does the enemy use distraction to hold us back?
I like the example I ended up using in the book. It's actually a very recent one, but it was a really kind of perfect example. When our most recent baby was born, we had pretty much decided this was going to be our last baby, and we were, really excited, really felt like it was the Lord. And so my wife, knowing, being a mom is just one of her absolute joys. And so knowing that this was our last baby, to really, savor the season and enjoy it. And, those of you who are parents know that the first few weeks and months of having a baby are a little bit tumultuous, getting adjusted. No matter how many times you do it, I think it's a big adventure every time. But I remember one of the nights I was, cleaning up after I'd put the older kids to bed, and my wife came down and she was crying. And I said, "Oh, what's wrong?" And she said, "Oh, I shouldn't have gone to the antique store." And I'm trying to remember when she actually, gone to the antique store, what she was talking about. And I vaguely remembered that, her sister had come down to visit, and they had, gone to the antique store one day when I was out at work or something. And, she was just saying, "I can't believe I went out. I took a 2-week-old baby out to go to the antique store. What was I thinking? I should have been resting. I should have been spending time with her. I should have, and all this stuff was going on in her head." And, she kept on kind of lamenting, even this feeling she had while her sister was visiting of, "Oh, I need to host her. I need to take her," even though, of course, her sister had come to help her with the baby. And as I was kind of, getting confused about why she was, in all this turmoil and kind of just hopping from subject to subject, I looked in the spirit and I saw this demon coming up to her, and it would just kind of reach behind her head and pull out this long filament of something, and it would just pull on it for a while, and then it would reach to another part of her head and pull at this other filament, and just kind of go from place to place to place, pulling on these things. And, finally I said, "Hey, stop, like this, yes, maybe you shouldn't have gone to the antique store. Maybe, yes, you shouldn't have, felt like you had to host your sister while she was here, just to help you. But all of this stuff is, even though this may be something that you need to process and kind of talk with yourself about how, you did something that maybe didn't fit with your values, that's not what this voice is trying to do. It's simply trying to distract you from the one thing that you need to do in this time, the one thing that you actually want to do, which is just to enjoy these first few days, these first few weeks with your brand new baby. Like, this was your hope. This was your dream. All of this stuff is simply being brought up in this abrasive over and over kind of way to pull you away from paying attention to that. And she just said, "What do I do?" I said, "Just stop. Don't worry about any of that other stuff right now. Just focus on enjoying baby." And she looked down at the baby was in her arms and just focused on her. And again, I saw this demon reach at her, and it was like its fingers got stuck in something. It couldn't actually reach her head anymore. That's a circumstance where it was, again, probably something that she needed to process, that she needed to figure out. But it just wasn't the time for that. It was time to focus on what was right in front of her. And I've seen this same kind of process again with all kinds of things, with being pulled towards focusing on stuff on social media, stuff, ideas, things that are not necessarily inherently bad, but that can distract us from what God's put right in front of us and where we actually want to put our attention in those moments. And again, I imagine that if that had gone on, that very same demon would be just kind of releasing accusation towards April of, "I can't believe you didn't pay more attention to your baby. I can't believe you spent so much time worrying about this, that, and the other thing." And that's just kind of what the enemy tries to do.
As we begin to, become unhindered and, we're no longer held back by the traps and the tactics of the enemy, how do we take that next step and, get shored up? How do we become indestructible?
Yeah, so this is, again, like I said, really the crux of the book is in creating a lifestyle that is just inhospitable for the enemy. And there's really 3 factors, at least that I see, that contribute the most to kind of living in this lifestyle. And I'll address all of them, but I'll kind of zoom in on one, or at least the one that I see that's needed the most. To me, it's all about, obviously, relationship with God. That's the bedrock of your life. Having a living, breathing connection with your Heavenly Father is going to remind you of who you are, remind you of who He is, and is going to fill your life with all of the things that, again, obviously just make you resistant to the lies of the enemy, make his lies seem silly and out of tune with reality. And so, again, I won't delve too deep into that right now, but again, obviously building a robust and healthy relationship with God. The next one that's really big is what I just like to call momentum, that you are living from glory to glory. You're meant to live victoriously. You're meant to do work that is satisfying. You're meant to happen in your life. And the more that we do that, the more resistant we are to the lies of the enemy, to the tricks of the enemy. But if I were to point to one thing that is the main gap that I tend to see in most Christians, it would be the third thing, which I like to call community. Now, I don't have time to get into a whole thing here, but community is not just the people that you're around. It's not just something that you run into. Community is something that you build, that you make, that you grow, that you take care of. It's spiritual mothers and fathers it's that are pouring into you. It's brothers and sisters that you're running with. It's sons and daughters that you're pouring into, that you're leading. And this ecosystem of human connection is a massive, massive part of building a healthy life in God. And one story that illustrates this so beautifully, I'll give a very, very brief version of this story, but I had a close friend who was going through a hard time. His wife had decided that she didn't want to be married anymore. Now, again, I don't have time to go into the nuances of all this, and these situations are always, more complicated than you can explain in just a couple of minutes. But he wanted to keep working on the relationship, and she did not. And so he came to me and my wife, and he said, "Hey, this is what's going on, and we haven't made anything final yet, but this is where we're at. And so I just wanted to, pull on some of my friends, pull on some of my mothers and fathers that are around me, just to invite you in to speak into my life, to give me feedback, to, be asking if I could ask you questions or pull on you if needed, just because I want to pull my community close during this hard time." And the whole time he was talking, I saw this demon in a dark cloak with a knife in its hand standing behind him. And it had this knife in its hand that was ready to just stab him, ready to just release so much darkness in his life. And, I met with him off and on over as this process continued. And even up until the day when it finally did become official and his wife did decide to go through with the divorce. And I saw all kinds of demons try to attack my friend, demons that were trying to release bitterness on him, that would make him angry at his wife, to make him accuse his wife, to make him see everything as her fault. I saw demons of depression trying to bring him self-pity, try to make him depressed, to try to have this sorrow and sadness he was going through, just ruin his whole life. And every single time I saw him, even though those things would reach out to him, would scratch at him, would try to get at him, there was this invisible barrier that they would just get stuck in. It's like they couldn't reach him. They couldn't touch him. And so I was, spending time with him through this whole process until we got to I guess it was a year and a half after the divorce was complete. And I can tell you, even though there was a lot of pain that he walked through and there was a lot of healing that he had to go through, his work life was better than it had ever been before. His friend life was better than it had ever been before. And his relationship with God was better than it ever had been before. And he was telling me that very thing as we sat and talked together. And at this point, every single one of the demons that had been trying to attack him was gone, all except for the one with the black cloak and that was holding a knife. And as he was talking about how even though he was still sad, how he was feeling ready to move on, how he was feeling closer to God and closer to his community, I saw this demon just out of rage, reach this hand, both its hands above its head, holding this knife, and plunge it down at my friend But again, it just glanced off this invisible something. And I could feel in that moment all of the darkness, all of the evil that demon wanted to release into my friend's life, how it wanted to destroy his life, his ex-wife's life, their future children's lives, their friends, their family. I was overwhelmed at how much darkness did not get to enter the world simply because my friend chose to pull his community close in a time of pain and confusion. And so, again, there's a lot of factors that go into creating a life that is indestructible. But if there is one that I see that's needed the most, it is learning how to create a true, real, and strong community around yourself that you can pull on, that you can be vulnerable with. And the effects of that are genuinely stunning. Again, this is not the only circumstance, but it's a perfect example of how much good it lets into someone's life and how much bad it just keeps out without really much effort.
Blake, when readers get to the last page of Indestructible, if there's one core message or one core encouragement that they take away, what do you most hope that is?
There are really two things, and they're really part of the same thing. But one, I would love that someone can walk away with an understanding that, yes, you can live an indestructible life, that the plots and plans of the enemy are not meant to harm you, that you are meant to live above those things. And that is really possible, not just possible, but actually God's intended normal. And so I'd love for everyone to walk away with realizing that is not only possible, but that's actually normal. The other side of the coin I'd love is that once we are able to, because God has created a pathway for us to be living indestructibly, that we can no longer live on the defensive, but instead live on the offensive. Not in attacking things, but in releasing God's light wherever we go, through every area of life, through whatever creative or kind or intelligent, whatever area of life that we're able to express His goodness in all the different ways that He's built us to express it. That rather than being on defensive or feeling like we're being, beaten to a corner by the enemy, that we're actually releasing God's kingdom wherever we go and actually being the light of the world that He's called His disciples to be.
And Blake, for the listeners who'd like to connect with you, find out more about Indestructible, where can they do that on the web?
So my website, you can find out more there at blakekhealy.com. And if they'd like to just connect more on a deeper level, or they're just really hungry for growing in some of this stuff, I'd encourage them to visit BethelAtlantaSchool.com to hear more about our school of ministry out here in the Atlanta area.
And I always feel like we would do a disservice if we don't have you talk a little bit about the school. Give us the elevator pitch version of the cool work you do there.
Yeah, so the School of Ministry is just one of my favorite things that I do. I've been teaching here for, I guess it's 11 years now, and I will not leave unless they drag me away. Because there's something truly humbling about having the opportunity to teach a group of people who have chosen to sacrifice some of their time, sacrifice some of their money, to devote a season to pursuing more of what God has for them, to grow in their identity in Christ, to get equipped in the prophetic and healing and the gifts of the Spirit, to discover the areas of life that God called them to shine in. There's something truly humbling about getting to teach a group of people like that and getting to see just the incredible growth that happens in people's lives. And so we're a part-time school. We really believe that people are meant to grow in this stuff while in their careers, while being involved in the world. So we're just Monday and Tuesday nights, and it's a 9-month program that runs from September to April. And yeah, it's truly just one of the most powerful experiences of my life when I went through school of ministry myself. And it is genuinely one of my greatest joys to have the opportunity to facilitate other people having that kind of season of growth and transformation. So it's a long elevator ride, but it's what I love about it.
You definitely brought us up a few floors with that level of detail, but it's important. Thank you for sharing that. And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Blake, find out more about the school, and pick up your own copy of the new book as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Blake Healy. Once again, our book today was Indestructible, Fight Your Spiritual Battles from the Winning Side. Again, for more on Blake, a great place to start is his website. You can find that over at blakekhealy.com. And for more on the school, be sure to check out BethelAtlantaSchool.com. And Blake, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you back on the show.
No, thanks for having me.